Well, hi there, Professor Jen, doing the last of our coffee table series 2025. It's truly been a pleasure. I've so enjoyed coming to these topics to be here with you, to share space, share ideas. Been doing the readings from the chat. I see that all of you have really gotten the hang of these discussions. It has been such a sincere pleasure to spend this semester with you here in this format. Any format would have been fine in person, online, whatever it takes. Just so wonderful to have multi-generational discussion, different ideas, different thoughts. So for our final part of the series, of course, I like to always, thank Captioning Services, been through us been with us rather, through thick and thin with us, doing all the services for us and supports since the very beginning of semester. I mean, really, we've had probably somewhere close to 30 of these coffee table series, never disappointed us with the captioning. And so I thank you for this final throw of our series. Of course, you always know I love to put up a picture. And so this picture is actually a clip, a still from the film Dog Day Afternoon. Dog Day Afternoon uh, was really a monumental film in the 1970s, starred Al Pacino and a bunch of other persons that you would clearly recognize in later films from the 1970s, 1980s that today people your age would call classic, vintage, etc. Maybe foundational film, groundbreaking film. And this film was actually a true story. I remember it when I was little. It immobilized and completely shut down all of Brooklyn, New York for about 3 days. It was a story about crime. And it really was one of the first sort of semi-fictional pieces. Though remember, it had a little bit of element of drama in it that probably really didn't exist, but it was fashioned after what had really happened. So maybe historical fiction. I don't know what we could call it exactly. But it really began in my life, in my culture, in my place and time, where people were really so taken with the idea in contemporary culture, pop culture, with crime. And this particular film, Dog Day Afternoon, brought up all kinds of things about hostage taking, about reality television. We think reality TV is new. It really isn't. Uh, it brought up issues about Attica Correctional Facilities just coming off the heels of the actual Attica riots. For those of you who need a little reference, geographically, we're about 40 to 50 miles away from Attica Correctional Facility. When I first started my on-the-job training, I first reported to Attica Correctional Facility, and I came to find out many years later I was one of the very first women that they hired after the Attica riots, that it was really a paramilitary environment that was best suited to hire male employees. Interestingly, at one point, my husband worked at Attica Correctional Facility after we were married, and I was his supervisor while he was at Attica Correctional Facility working with persons that were incarcerated. So this film was sort of a gateway film. I'll mention another film, Panic in Needle Park, also starred Al Pacino. The film actually used real drug addicts in the film who were actively using drugs in the film and actually coming off of drugs in the film. And it really lent to its authenticity. And the fact that people in pop culture at that place and time, 1970s, wanted to get a glimpse of what crime is like, what crime might be able to feel like, etc. People have become long-standing uh, observers. They become fascinated with true life crimes. We saw the similar situation with the film called Monster. It was actually a film that was about Charlize Theron's character that walked around and was a serial killer in Florida of men. People were very fascinated with her. Eileen Wuornos was the actual criminal's name. She was given the death sentence. People were very fascinated with that case as well as they were fascinated with the child killer case. Uh, Casey Anthony and her family, little Kaylee Anthony, the little girl that went missing, and they found her remains a year later. Till this day, nobody has been charged with her actual death. Many people fascinated. I think of 1993-ish, JonBenet Ramsey, little girl, 6 years old, found dead in her affluent Colorado basement. People very taken with that crime. And we look at others, Ted Bundy, very famous serial killer, Charles Manson, not only a serial killer, cult leader. And we could do this all day. We could even say the late uh, football hero there. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Whole situation with the decapitation of several people over his failed marriage, etc. We become so fascinated. Arthur Shawcross here in Rochester, Genesee River, serial killer, charged with killing, raping, assaulting, maiming, cutting into body parts, etc., burying in shallow graves. Arthur Shawcross, all these horrible situations, these terrible crimes that he committed against these women, usually commercial sex workers, etc., women from dance clubs that dance, in the sex industry, persons that gave massages, some people that used the phone, the internet at the time for finding partners for sexual liaison for money. Today we call that really not so much prostitution. We call it very often sex trafficking. But, we look at all of these different crimes. Why are we so fascinated? All these crime shows, all these crime films. You know, you can look at Hulu, you can look at all of these different streaming services. There are all kinds of films all about crime. We seem to be so fascinated by crime because I'll tell you why. I'll tell you what I think about this, in my opinion. I think we're fascinated how the average person can turn on a dime. You know, when I worked in correctional facilities, I worked in correctional facilities for a few years, and I went to work in jail for 10 years. I worked in pre-release, post-release activities, worked for the city of Rochester, doing all kinds of outreach and providing programs for very, very difficult populations, etc. How people can just turn so easily. We look at people, we say, oh, they're not really capable of all these things. They would never hurt a fly. Oh, yeah, they would. And it turns on a dime. I've worked with thousands of people over the years that tell these very interesting stories that if not for the drug use, they probably wouldn't have committed certain crimes. They wouldn't have been, terribly violent. They wouldn't have gone to theft. They wouldn't have gone to white collar crime, fraud, etc. I work with people that uh, maybe they had sworn up and down that they'd never recidivate, they'd never reoffend. And then, of course, unfortunately, especially with pedophiles, people that are attracted to young children for sexual purposes, they say all these things, go to all these therapies, go to all these programs, and then I read in the paper or today's streaming services, I really don't handle the paper anymore. Who really buys a paper, right? And I read that they've reoffended. So we say they talk a good game, so many people, but they do it again. Pyromania very often comes up in teenage years, public urination, all kinds of very deviant behavior. And we look at the system and we have all this rehabilitation as children. And then we find out that, very often, more often than not, by the way, that you look at these kids that commit all these crimes as youth, vandalism, all kinds of very interesting crimes. It's beyond just being a juvenile. And, boys will be boys, girls will be girls. It's beyond that. And then they wind up in adulthood with all kinds of DWIs and DUIs and assaults, and they're not gainfully employed. It's just for some reason, and I still really don't have the answer after 3 decades and change of being in the criminal justice business and aspects of criminal justice. I don't really have a reason. scientifically to suggest why, after all these programs and rehabilitative services, people continue to do the same things. There was a case not far from here in a place called Horseheads. That's if you go sort of towards Corning, Ithaca, uh, Cornell University. So really down 390. So in relation to RIT, probably 2 hours south. Horseheads area, Fishers. There was this Eric Smith, little redheaded boy. And I'll just say this is a little bit of a trigger warning, but I'll go gently today. I don't feel like getting into anything too heavy myself. But to make my point, Eric Smith, he waited for this little Derek Roby who was 4 years old, and he stalked him, and he was predatory. One day he waited for Derek Roby to come on his little bicycle down a little field path, like a little canal way, no big deal in the neighborhood. And I say this gently, so here's the warning. If you don't feel like hearing it, turn me off for about 30 seconds and click me back on. And Eric Smith not only beat little Derek Roby, he also raped him with a foreign object, left him for dead, and did kill him. And never really explained why. Not that there is a legitimate why, of course, that sounds nuts too, but never really gave any insight why. We did get insight over the years that Eric Smith had talked about being abused himself. He talked about a very strange scenario, set of circumstances with his step parent, his stepfather. He talked about having been bullied himself. His sister, at one point, had spoken out about occurrences in their childhood that she felt that contributed to Eric Smith's issues. Of course, she didn't seem to have any issues, and they lived in the same house. But we learn in criminal justice, as it relates certainly to this class, literary context, as well as pop culture, that you can have four people living in the same house and have four very different experiences. So I don't want to vilify her either, but she does tell some little stories about some incidents withholding food and sequestering of Eric Smith and targeting and bullying, and the fact that her mother had sort of looked the other way because she wanted the stepfather to stay. I hear this story over and over again. And we see it in film. We see a lot of this kind of, the makings of a criminal, whether it's a child or an adult. What are the ingredients? Like if we were to make a sandwich, a stew, you say, oh, well, what are the ingredients? Well, you have to have 2 slices of bread for a sandwich, or if you go vegetable, 2 slices of pepper. We have some kind of a standard to make a sandwich. I remember I was speaking with this fellow who was a counselor over at Rochester Regional Mental Health Center. They're a very, very good center. But unfortunately, they also deal with a lot of adolescents that have interfaced with the criminal justice system as well. So it's not like they come to Rochester Regional looking for general counseling. Very often, something has triggered the event. Either this child has become a victim of a crime, usually sexual situations, unfortunately, or the child has done something very peculiar outside of the cultural expectation, societal normative of what children do, you know, and they wind up in counseling. And this bill once said that they have a checklist of like 13 characteristics of children that can really fall beyond at-risk population. So Bill had shared with me, I'm just giving this to you off the top of my head, but there could be other checklists that even have more criteria. He talked about a dead parent, the parent that had passed away during childhood, and so the child right off the bat is missing a parent. They talked about the child who's missing two parents. It could happen that both parents are incarcerated. Maybe both parents have mental illness. Maybe one has passed away, the other has never recovered from the loss. So really the absence of both parents. Then they talk about, not having, what do you say, continuous living situation. There's a lot of moving. There's a lot of instability. I guess that's the word. geographic instability, a lot of isolation, the constant moving. In addition to, you could also have the loss of parent and or parents. Or you could have two parents in the house and or caregivers, and they can have alcohol, substance abuse issues. Then you add that along with divorce, you add that along with continuous moving, you add poverty, you add food inconsistency, food shortage, food insecurity, and just this list continues to go on. And you can have siblings that commit crimes. You can have a whole house full of different arrangements that contribute to the fact that maybe you're going to be in a situation less than optimal and then wind up with, quite a series of situations, you know, deep-seated anger, deep-seated resentment. I saw a lot of that when I worked with at-risk youth, when I worked with convicted youth at one point here in Rochester, 2016. I had a very interesting little summer job. Uh, I called them the little sweeties. I say it fondly, though. I worked with 19 children that were referred by local courts here that had already committed crime, and they had this at-risk youth program, which was sort of late in the game. They were beyond at-risk youth. They already demonstrated they could do very interesting things if left unattended, very violent things. I worked with them for about 3 months here in Rochester. I think back about that job frequently. I really didn't like the administration I worked for. They seemed to really dislike these kids. And that's not what these kids needed. These kids needed a lot of positive interaction. They needed a lot of encouragement. They needed an awful lot of information about other lifestyles. And I remember they had this point system at the very beginning of the program where, they were told that they couldn't miss any of the classes program days, which were 5 days a week, and they ran for 8 weeks. So that was 40 sessions that they could not miss. Well, that didn't make any sense. You and I know life happens. People don't feel good. People have issues, whatever. And within the first week, most of them had an absence. So to tell a bunch of at-risk slash convicted youth that they've already failed the program after week one because they were missing one of these modules, well, how do you get them back for the next 7 weeks? So I had said to one of the program administrators, I said, I'm going to build in a Tuesday night. I said on these Tuesday nights, I'm going to offer some kind of a dinner, maybe spaghetti supper, something inexpensive with some dessert. And then that way we have that little out once a week where Tuesday nights they can make up these hours because there would really be no incentive. If week one you're already missing, you've already failed. So you have to have some kind of incentive. So of course this administrator who I wasn't particularly fond of, that's all right. That person didn't like me either. That's all right. It said, well, I'm not reimbursing you in the budget for the meals. I said, well, that's fine. I said, I don't, well, big deal. I can afford spaghetti supper, make subs. I know how to make economical meals for the Tuesday night, but you've already set these kids up to fail. So my husband, Ted, he was very kind in helping. He'd go to Panera and Starbucks and we would get the stuff that didn't sell, for donation. I'd bring that in. So I had really a nice full menu for these kids, and the kids loved it. And lo and behold, every Tuesday night for the 8 weeks, my program grew and grew. I had people sitting there that clearly didn't miss that week. They still wanted to come have dinner, help me make the dinner on the premises, put things out. We'd sit, we'd laugh at the table. I really enjoyed these kids an awful lot. And, I didn't care that I didn't get reimbursed. I saw the purpose in having the Tuesday nights to help them make up for the fact that they were losing the time. I didn't want them to fail. They already failed in so many ways. And I look at these programs, I say, well, what were the outcomes, right? That's 9 years ago, right? Talk about true crime, talk about fascination with statistics. I'm sorry to say most of those kids reoffended. I looked them up. Sometimes I remember the last names or I see people here in Rochester and they're back in the system. I say to myself, is it that we got them too late, getting them at 14, 15, 16? I had one that was 17. Was that too late? should we have really captured them maybe at 9, 10, 11 years old? At what point do we say we have to intervene? We have to bring in other programs, additional supports? I look at all these programs on television that that speak about persons that enter the criminal justice system. I don't really think, from all of my experience in working in prisons and jails, thinking of the thousands of people I've dealt with, I really don't think that they just came into the system, most of them at 40, 50, 60 years old. There was a history there. There was a history that maybe nobody else saw, and or they didn't get caught, or perhaps that they did get caught and somebody sort of gave them a little slap on the wrist and didn't say very much. And just it snowballed. It just completely snowballed. I worked for many years. We'll call her Miss S. Miss S there. I like her. I still see her around Rochester. She does a lot of outreach work now, but she had like 40 years from teenage right until her mid 50s, where she was in and out of the penal system here in New York State, Rochester, New York, all kinds of convictions. And it just like never really seemed to stop. I don't know if her crime spree of fraud, etc., other activities, aggressions, hitting, slapping, spitting at people. I don't know if that stopped or they just stopped charging her, or that there's really no room in the current criminal justice system for people. At the time of this taping, April 2025, we're at a place really since COVID, March 2020, where we've really been emptying out prisons and jails rather than building new ones and putting people in for rehabilitative services. So we say, well, is that because crime has, become less? Well, no, it's because the sentencing structure has changed greatly. We have more people under community supervision than we ever did before historically in the state of New York. That's a fact. Community supervision means an ankle bracelet or wristlet. It means not being able to leave your home or a certain perimeter of your home, a certain radius of your home. We have community supervision, meaning that either on electronic, computer, and or good old time footwork, people make sure that people aren't leaving their areas, or if they are, they're leaving for pre-prescribed appointments such as medical, dental, maybe a little part-time job where the person has electronic monitoring on them. And so therefore, they really don't need to be in a facility, providing that the electronic monitoring and the people that watch the monitoring are sufficient. So things have greatly changed in pop culture, how we even address the whole situation with incarceration and how we even define it. Community supervision is considered part of the Department of Corrections program, but how we see it is much different. Here in Monroe County, we've closed many jails. We've lost one big jail. I worked there for about 10 years, provided services, etc., programs, outreach, support, etc. And they closed it. That was 782 beds. Sometimes what we don't see in popular culture and media and film is that jail and prison sometimes is an entry to care. It's a gateway to care. People often interface with the system. They haven't had medical care in decades. When people go to jail, especially here in Monroe County, they get a full physical. And if they need prescription drugs for diabetes, cholesterol, depression, you name it, they get the health care. It's an exceptional place if people need health care, in addition to the fact that they need rehabilitative service. Same with dental care. Sometimes jail and prison is a very good entry place for people to get dental care and, in addition, serve their time. Sometimes jail and prison, wonderful place to get a GED, wonderful place to get high school equivalency. Adult basic education, I taught all of those in prison and in jails as well. Sometimes in jail, more so in prison, because in New York State, jail is not really about the crime, it's about the time of the sentence. So it's 364 days or less. In prison, it's 365 days or more. So it's really dependent on where you're going to be located and housed based on the time, not necessarily the crime. So in the prison setting, people go to college that have long sentences. I ran those programs as well for the state of New York Department of Corrections and Genesee Region, Region number 2. So people can often go to prison, do a 4-year sentence, also leave with great dental work, get their health in check, get their mental health in check, have their physical therapy, their occupational therapy if they need that, get a what do you call it, a college degree. Some people actually get certifications while in prison. They learn other trades, allied professions, such as skilled labor, welding, woodworking, electrical engineering, etc. Uh, what else? Horticulture, cooking, dog training for service dogs. So there are a lot of professions people can learn while incarcerated, as well as getting a 2-year degree, a 4-year degree. I've known colleges in New York State to offer master's degree level as well while people are incarcerated. So entry to care is something we don't really see very much in media because why? Because the taxpayer, there we go, the taxpayer, including myself, people like me, people like you, we all pay taxes. 6-year-olds pay taxes, right? They go to Dollar Tree, they pay tax. They buy something at Walmart, they pay tax. So we're all taxpayers. The taxpayer really doesn't want to hear about any of that. The majority I found over my entire career, my husband could probably say the same. He worked in corrections for quite some time. He helps me with some aspects of Paper Bag Ladies, my little foundation to help people that are voiceless and underrepresented. Most people that pay taxes don't want to hear about all of the perks. They don't want to hear about things that people receive in prison. It bothers them. They would rather hear of very punitive environments that talk about, I'll give you an example, making, little rocks out of big rocks, very hard labor, etc. But that's really not how recovery works. It's really not how uh, they call it Department of Corrections for a reason because people are coming not only to serve time, but to be corrected, you see, to have that foundation of being corrected, being able to have the word reentry, reentry back into society so they don't recidivate, meaning go back in or have new aspirations, new tricks to go back out. But I do have to say, it's very hard to take somebody, say, that's making $2, $3 million a year, even for $500,000 a year. I'm thinking about people I work with, $100,000 a year working in drug sales. It's very hard to take somebody that comes from prison and tell them how, working $18 an hour, $15 an hour at Dollar Tree, at Wendy's, at McDonald's will, better their life, after they've made 100,000, 200,000, $300,000 selling drugs. It's very hard to make that case. They deal with a lot of depression when they come out. They say, but I was used to making all this money and working 15 minutes a day, and now I'm working 40 hours a week, and I have much less, and I'm living much differently. And very often they go right back to the life of crime because they say, in their case, crime pays. They say, I've had many, many people say to me, I lived well for 5, 6 years. My family had all the things that they needed. And okay, if I get caught every 5 or 6 years and have to do 4 years over it, for me, it was worth it. This is what they tell me. They have told me this for decades. They say, well, it's the price of doing business because my family had better things than if I had worked at Dollar Tree. So it's very hard sometimes, as we see in media, it's very hard to make these arguments for many people that crime doesn't pay. I see this in human trafficking all the time. I see this especially with commercial sex workers, women that say, I know what I'm doing is illegal, I know that it's eating at me every day, like death by, 1,000 pieces of glass, death by 1,000 paper cuts. I know it's killing me every day, but where else am I going to make $2,000, $3,000 a day in commercial sex work? Where am I going to make $3,000, $4,000 in a week worth of filming adult film? Where am I going to make, say, $10,000 in muling for a month? Drugs back and forth up I-95, up the New York State Thruway, etc. They're like, where am I supposed to make all this money and have ability to live? How am I supposed to do all this on minimum wage? And I can sit there as Pastor Jen, I can sit there as Chaplain Jen, I can sit there as Professor Jen, or just Jen. I can give all these, you know, different aspects of why they shouldn't do it. But at the end of the day, if a person is responding to money, if they're responding to an economic system, if this is what drives their motivation for crime, for living, for loving, for dying, for surviving, Jen over here doesn't really have much to say because I can't really compete with the almighty dollar. That's really what it comes down to. So yeah, so it's such an intriguing subject, when we look at different types of crime, we look at the people that are behind these crimes. Here's a question. Why do people steal that can clearly pay for things? I met this woman, I'll close with this idea, right? I met this woman, she was in her 60s. She never had a record, never stole anything. And I met her several years ago at Monroe County Jail. She started stealing meat from one of the stores. I don't remember if it was Wegmans or Walmart, but some kind of format like that. She was stealing packaged meat. And and she had like a 30-day sentence. She was stealing a lot of meat. And I said to her, were you having a food insecurity issue? She was retired from Eastman Kodak. So I couldn't imagine there was a food insecurity issue because she had retirement, she had pension. She said, no. She said, I started to grow very angry, she said, over some things that happened to me regarding sexual abuse and other abuses, abandonment, etc. when I was a child, she said, and I guess stealing was how it was coming out in my 60s. She said, and she told me, I mean, I would have no other way of knowing if it was true or not, but she said that she had no former history of any crime, drug abuse, substance abuse. But as she got older, she became very bitter over what had happened to her. She didn't know how to seek help, didn't have people to speak with, really very limited support system. And I have to say, in her favor, I have to agree, in her 60s, she was embarrassed to say something. She was afraid people wouldn't believe her, etc. She felt shame, guilt, etc. over her abuses, as a victim. See that a lot. Anyway, she said, so when she stole, she felt like the anger was someplace else. Similarly, I heard things like this from people younger than all of you. Teenage years, people that did self-injurious behaviors, SIBs, that did self-mutilation, cutting, we all know somebody who cut and cut themselves, etc. And she said every time she stole, she just sort of, the pain went somewhere else. So she was a good example how the pain had to go elsewhere. I don't know whatever happened to her. She might even be deceased by now. That was quite some years ago. She was in her 60s. But, you meet different people along the way that do different things. You wonder what was their motivation. This is why I'm so convinced all of these shows, I mean, shows about, reality-based crime, shows that are drama, shows that have crime in them, but they're also a comedy drama or they're a dramedy. We're just so in awe of all this. Understanding the human experience, I suppose, would be the great way to explain it. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. If you ever have time, Dog Day Afternoon, a wonderful film, has a lot of LGBTQ and trans issues in the film because it really did happen in the 1970s, how we address trans LGBTQ issues. So certainly from that perspective, a lot about polyamory in that film, where you have a character who was in love with two different people at the same time, two different genders, etc., and how people saw their own sexuality. That's a very interesting aspect of this film. I'll give you another couple recommendations if you ever have time. Go see Monster. You can probably get it for free. The Eileen Wuornos story. She was one of the very first female serial killers that killed men all up and down Florida Panhandle. Another good film, Boy A. A is in the letter A. Boy A. It's a British film all about murder, similar to the Eric Smith case that I shared with you briefly. Very good films. There's another good film if you really like to be entertained. It's called Irina Palm, Irena space Palm. It's about a grandmother who turns to the sex industry to make money because her grandson needs all kinds of health care. A very, very good film. If you're interested in that one, certainly go see that. Sleepers, Sleepers. Excellent film about a bunch of neighborhood young kids younger than you know, like 12, 13, 14 years old, who are just sort of being kids. They're not criminals, but they make one little mistake. And unfortunately, this little mistake is very, very intense, and it brings them to a different place in their early adulthood life. And it's a very good film. It's a difficult film to watch, but a good film. Shawshank Redemption, that's a very good film too, talking about persons that are innocent, persons that are guilty, how people interface with the criminal justice system, and what it's like to be a reentry person. So, you must have your own films that you've seen as well. Do mention them in chat if you wish, with a recommendation, if you will. I wish you a wonderful day. Today's Palm Sunday, Passover, a nice spring day. So I hope this day found everybody well, feeling good, and getting ready for the last few weeks of the semester. So I'll say goodbye to you. I wish you well. Have a good day. Bye bye.